All right, here's the deal, guys. Please open up to the next set of notes that I hope you guys had a chance to print out for today. There are the notes that at the top say Part B, changes in the equilibrium price level and output. Guys, please number these page 6. This will be the 6th page in the Unit 4 section of your notes. And as you're doing that, let's kind of review some of the important things, right? Today, guys, we're continuing our discussion on Unit 4. And don't forget that in Unit 4, the main idea is learning about the aggregate model, aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, right? At the beginning of this unit, we talked about aggregate demand, aka total spending in our economy. Recently, we finished up our discussion on aggregate supply, right? Total production in our economy. And yesterday, we brought them both together as we addressed the concept of aggregate equilibrium, right? When you bring them both together, you can identify the equilibrium point, and you can see the price level that's going to occur in the economy, along with the real GDP level that's going to occur in the economy. And then, towards the end of class yesterday, we discussed what happens when you shift aggregate demand or when you shift aggregate supply. And we observed how the price level would change on the vertical axis and how the GDP level would change on the horizontal axis. So, this activity here, page 6 in your notes, is going to help review those concepts of shifting our lines and observing how the equilibrium values change. So, let's get to it. Number 4 says, Congress passes a tax cut for the middle class and the president signs it. So, we have a tax cut for the middle class. Now guys, when we have these major changes in the economy, the question you want to ask yourself is, what line is going to shift? Aggregate demand or aggregate supply? And to make that easier, remember, I like to think of aggregate demand as being total spending, and I like to think of aggregate supply as being total production. All right? So, in this scenario, guys, if there is a tax cut for people like you and me, is that going to affect spending or is that going to affect production? Spending, right? Hopefully that makes sense, right? If there's a tax cut for people like us, we get to keep more of our money, which means we, as consumers, are going to spend more, right? So guys, this is going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand, okay? Now, before we illustrate that on the graph here, let's be sure to identify the original equilibrium values, right? So, here guys, where aggregate demand intersects the original short-run aggregate supply, we call this point a short-run equilibrium. This point represents what's happening now in our economy before any major change happened, right? So we can observe what the price level is initially at PL sub 1, and we can observe what the GDP level is initially at Y sub 1. But then this major change occurs, there is a tax cut for the middle class, and that allows people like you and I to spend more, so total spending is going to go up. There's going to be an increase in aggregate demand. So guys, remind me, which direction do we shift aggregate demand? To the right, correct? If there's an increase in total spending, it's going to shift to the right. So we label the initial one with the subscript 1, we draw an arrow to the right, and draw in our new aggregate demand curve and label it with the subscript 2. Okay? So here we have a new short-run equilibrium. We have a new point that is now occurring in the economy. So we've got to be sure to identify the new equilibrium values. So we trace this over, and here's the new price level that's occurring in our economy. And we trace this down, and here's our new level of real GDP that's occurring in our economy. So guys, when in doubt, you can draw out the graph, and you can easily visualize what's going to happen to the price level and the real GDP. So guys, in looking at the graph, what has clearly happened to the price level as a result of this increase in total spending? What happened to the price level, guys? It went up, right? Bear with me here, okay? It went up from PL sub 1 to PL sub 2, right? So there was an increase in the price level, okay? Furthermore, as we go from Y sub 1 to Y sub 2, what happened to the real GDP level, guys? It increased as well. Thank you. Yes, very good, right? It increased as well, so real GDP has gone up, all right? Now, we can also think through these things conceptually, so you can save time without having to draw the graph out, right? So, do you remember, guys, if demand shifts, do you remember what kind of change is going to happen with the variables? Direct or inverse? When demand shifts, there'll be a direct change in the variables, right? And they're going to follow suit with what demand does, right? So if there's an increase in demand, that means people want it more and they're willing to pay a higher price, right? Hence the increase in the price level. Now, you remember, guys, that higher price, is that good or bad for business? Higher prices, is that good or bad for business? That's good for business, right? At the higher prices, businesses can afford to produce more, and that's why the real GDP ended up going up, okay? So, hopefully you guys remember that conceptual direct change whenever demand shifts. Okay? The last thing I want to emphasize about this part of our activity, guys, what do we call it when there's an increase in the price level? Is that inflation or deflation, guys? It's inflation, right? Do you remember from yesterday's class, there were two types of inflation? We had demand pull and we had cost push inflation. Guys, in this scenario, what happened here? What kind of inflation? Demand pull or cost push? Demand pull, right? Since it was aggregate demand shifting, hopefully it makes sense, guys, that we had what is called demand pull inflation. And I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but there's never any good inflation. But of the two types of inflation that there is, there's one that's better than the other. Guys, was demand pull the better or the worse of the two? It was the better of the two, right? Because at least this time, the increase in the price level, at least this time, the inflation is being driven by an increase in economic activity. And that's what's causing prices to go up, right? So remember, guys, demand pull inflation, right? It's not ideal, but it's the better of the two types of inflation. Okay, good. So I've gone over the first one as a model for you. I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock because I don't think it's going to take that long. There's about 7 other examples for you guys to work through, right? And remember, if you did get a chance to print this stuff out, you can always access it on your phone via the class website. You can open up the PDF file, take out a clean sheet of paper, and kind of jot down the notes as you go along on your phone via the PDF. So I'll put 2 minutes on the clock, guys. Please do your best to finish up this activity. Let's take a look at it, okay? Now, with the rest of this activity, guys, I don't want us to get reliant on graphs. I want you guys to be able to see a multiple choice question and conceptually walk your way through it. So you don't have to waste your time drawing graphs. It's going to save you a lot of time on the actual AP exam, especially on the multiple choice section. So let's take a look here. Number 5 says, during a recession, the government increases spending on schools, highways, and other public works. The key thing is, guys, the government increases spending. So when you're trying to think of what line is going to shift, you want to ask yourself this question. Is this going to affect spending, or is this going to affect production? Guys, what do you think? Spending, right? When the government spends more, there's going to be an increase in total spending, right? So here, guys, we're going to have an increase in aggregate demand. So, first thing, guys, remind me, when demand shifts, do you remember what kind of change occurs between the variables? Direct or inverse? There'll be a direct change, right? And it follows suit with whatever aggregate demand does, right? So there's going to be an increase in the price level, and there's going to be an increase in real GDP, okay? Quickly, let's discuss conceptually why that is, right? If there's an increase in demand, guys, do people want it more or do they want it less? If there's an increase in demand, do they want it more or less, guys? More. They want it more. If they want it more, are they willing to pay a higher price for it? Yes. Yes, and that's why the price level goes up, right? And as a result of those higher prices, are higher prices good or bad for business, guys? Good. They're good for business, right? At that higher price level, businesses can afford to bring more to market, and that's why real GDP is going up. So, I know it sounds weird, guys, but these are the exact same concepts that we learned back in microeconomics. And they can still be applied here in macro. You just got to keep in mind, though, that they're being applied on a much, much larger scale. Okay? Good. Next, let's move on to number 6. Number 6 says, new oil discoveries cause large decreases in energy prices. So, the major change here, guys, is a large decrease in energy prices. So, now you want to ask yourself, what's going to be affected in society? Total spending or total production? What do you guys think? Spending or production here? If there's a decrease in energy costs, specifically because of oil. Production, yes, very good. Right? Remember, oil is one of the most important raw materials we have in our economy. So when the price of oil changes, that is definitely going to affect production. Okay? So, since there is a decrease in the cost of production, is that going to make it easier or harder to produce, guys? Easier, right? If production costs have gone down, that means it's easier for businesses to produce. And as a result, guys, what's going to happen to supply if it's easier to produce? It's going to increase, right? So here, guys, we're going to have an increase in the short run aggregate supply, right? So on the graph, guys, there would be a shift right of the SRAS, okay? But again, I don't want you to rely on the graph. I want to think through this stuff conceptually, right? So let's see if you guys remember. When supply shifts, do you remember what kind of change happens with the variables? Direct or inverse? Inverse. Very good, right? So one is going to go up, the other is going to go down. And remember, for me, when we talk about shifting supply, it's easiest for me to think of the change in GDP. it's easiest for me to think of the change in production. And I bet you guys can figure it out too. When there's an increase in supply, guys, what do you think is going to happen to production? Is it going to go up or down? It's going to go up, right? So hopefully it makes sense, guys, that there's going to be an increase in the real GDP if there's an increase in supply. Now, if this one is going up, and we know there's an inverse change, what's definitely going to happen to the price level, guys? It's going to go down. There'll be a decrease in the price level because of the inverse change, right? So price level goes down, and real GDP goes up. Now, conceptually, this works too, right? When there's an increase in supply, because it's easier to produce, more production is going to happen. Real GDP is going to go up. And then remember, guys, when there's a lot of stuff lying around, when there's a lot of it around, does it gain value or lose value when there's a lot of it hanging around? It loses value, right? And that's why the price level goes down here. So you can walk through these things conceptually as well. Number 7, illustrate the effects of an increase in aggregate demand. Guys, we've done that twice already, right? When there's an increase in total spending, when there's an increase in aggregate demand, do people want it more or do they want it less, guys? They want it more. Are they willing to pay a higher price? Yes, and that's why the price level goes up. Remember, guys, that higher price level, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the business? That's a good thing. They can afford to produce more, they can afford to bring more to market, and that's why real GDP goes up. Okay? And again, on the graph, guys, we would illustrate this with a rightward shift in aggregate demand. Okay? Good. Now, let's take a look at the 4 examples on the back. Number 8, it says illustrate the effects of an increase in production costs. An increase in production costs. So, first thing you want to ask yourself, guys, is this going to affect spending or production? Production, right? We're talking about an increase in production costs. So hopefully it makes sense that production is what's going to be affected. And guys, what line represents production? Supply or demand? Supply, right? Now, if there's an increase in production costs, guys, if it costs more for you as a business owner to produce your product, is that going to make it easier or harder to produce? It's make it harder to produce. So what's going to happen to supply, guys? Will it increase or decrease? It'll decrease, right? This is going to create a decrease in the short run aggregate supply. Now, do you remember from yesterday, guys? Would we call this a positive supply shock or a negative supply shock? If there's a decrease in short run aggregate supply. This would be a negative supply shock, right? And remember, that's the worst thing that can happen to an economy, right? And let's see why that is, okay? Remind me, guys, when supply is shifted, what kind of change happens with the variables? Direct or inverse? There's going to be an inverse change, right? One goes up while the other goes down. And when we shift supply, I like to start with GDP because I think it's obvious, right? If there is a decrease in supply, guys, are we producing more or are we producing less? Less, right? So hopefully it makes perfect sense, guys, that there's going to be a decrease in real GDP. And guys, if there's a decrease in real GDP, right? If there's not a bunch of stuff lying around, right? If things become more rare, in other words, what's going to happen to their value? The price level. It's going to increase, right? That'll lead to an increase in the price level, as we can see here. Okay? And guys, we would illustrate a negative supply shock by shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Now, there's a couple of other key things I want to emphasize here. All right? Guys, remind me, when there is an increase in the price level, what do we call that again? Inflation or deflation? Inflation. And remember, there are 2 types of inflation we can experience. Demand pull and cost push. Guys, in this scenario, what type of inflation are we experiencing? Cost push, right? So very good. In this scenario, guys, put a little star here. We're experiencing cost push inflation. And guys, of the 2 types of inflation, is this the better one or the worse one? This is the worst one, right? This results from a negative supply shock, and this is the worst thing that can happen to the economy. So now, the price level isn't going up because there's an increase in economic activity. Instead, the price level is going up because it's becoming more difficult for businesses to produce. And that is the worst type of inflation we can experience in the economy. Okay? Good. Another thing I want to emphasize here, guys, right? We've already talked about how, right now, as a result of this negative supply shock, there is an increase in inflation. Remind me, guys, as a result of the negative supply shock, what happened to the real GDP again? Did it go up or did it go down? It went down, right? We weren't producing as much because things were harder to produce. So there is a decrease in real GDP. Now, remind me, guys, what phase of the business cycle would we be in if there is a decrease in production? Expansion or contraction?
Contraction.
we'd be experiencing contraction, right? And remember, what naturally happens to the unemployment rate whenever contraction occurs? Will unemployment rise or decrease when there's... It's going to increase, right? During times of contraction, when the economy slows down, we're not producing as much, which means we don't need to have as many workers, which means unemployment will rise. The reason why I bring this up, guys, there's a special name. When we have simultaneous inflation and simultaneous increases in unemployment, do you remember what very bad thing is occurring? What we called that in yesterday's class? We took an online quiz about it, hopefully, yesterday. Stagflation. Yes, very good, right? In this example, guys, the negative supply shock seen here caused stagflation, a simultaneous increase in inflation and unemployment. And again, that's the worst thing that can happen in our economy. Okay? Good. Next up, number 9. New technology and better education increases productivity. You want to ask yourself, guys, is this going to affect spending or production? Production. Is production going to be easier or harder, guys? Easier, right? So we're going to have an increase in the short run aggregate supply, right? It's going to shift to the right. The easiest one to start with is real GDP, right? If there's an increase in supply, hopefully it makes sense that production is going up. There's going to be an increase in real GDP. And you remember, guys, when supply shifts, what kind of change occurs between the variables? Direct or inverse? There'll be an inverse change, right? So if the GDP is going up, we know that the price level is going down, right? Because now things are much more readily available. There's a lot of stuff hanging around, so it loses value and the price level drops. Okay? And again, we would illustrate this positive supply shock by shifting the aggregate supply curve to the right, like so. Good. Next, let's take a look at number 10. It says, a new president makes consumers and businesses more confident about the future economy. And it says, note, only show the change in aggregate demand. And guys, I think this is pretty easy, right? If consumer confidence goes up, what's going to happen to total spending? Guys, right? If consumers are feeling more confident about the economy, they're going to spend more, right? An increase in consumer confidence leads to an increase in aggregate demand. We'll have a positive demand shock, okay? And guys, what's going to happen to the price level if people want things more? It's going to increase, right? There'll be an increase in the price level. And those higher prices, is that good or bad for business, guys? Good. That's good. Businesses can afford to produce more, and that'll lead to an increase in the real GDP, right? Again, further emphasizing the direct change in the variables whenever demand shifts, okay? Good. So again, increase in the price level, increase in real GDP, and we would illustrate the increase in aggregate demand by shifting it to the right. Finally, guys, number 11. With the unemployment rate at 5%, the federal government reduces personal taxes and the government increases spending. And again, it says only show the change in aggregate demand. So again, guys, if the government spends more and if they let us keep more of our money, what's going to obviously happen to total spending, guys? It's going to increase, right? This would be an increase in aggregate demand that would drive up the price level, which would drive up the real GDP. Right? Just like the positive demand shock that we saw in the previous example. Okay. So guys, any questions about shifting these lines and how the equilibrium values change? Good. Next thing I'd like you to do is please open up to the next set of notes that I hope you guys had a chance to print out. The ones that say long run aggregate supply and the production possibilities curve. Okay. Please number these page 7, guys. These will be the 7th page in the Unit 4 section of your notes. And again, if you didn't get a chance to print these out, you can access them via the website on your phone and look at the PDF file and follow along. Okay? Now, the first 3 paragraphs of this activity are very important. They have a lot of good information. So I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock, guys. It won't take that long. Please take the next 2 minutes and please read the first 3 paragraphs on the sheet of paper. Okay, guys, the purpose of this activity is to take the concept that we introduced yesterday called the long run aggregate supply and show how similar it is to a concept we learned back in the day that we call the production possibilities curve. Okay? So let's take a look at the graphs themselves and start kind of trying to figure out the difference here. Or see how similar they are is probably what I should say. So notice, guys, back in the day, we talked about a graph called the PPC, the production possibilities curve, right? And if you guys can recall, on that graph, it wasn't your typical price and quantity. We had something like good A on the vertical axis and something like good B on the horizontal. And then we had a line that bowed out from the origin that showed us our production possibilities, right? If a point was on the inside of this curve, we called it an inefficiency point. If it was on the curve itself, we called it an efficient point. And if it was outside of the curve, we called it an unattainable point. Okay? Now, yesterday, hopefully you guys can recall, we introduced a concept called the LRAS in the context of our aggregate model. Okay? So remember what this looked like, right? On our aggregate model, we had our vertical axis and our horizontal axis. We had the price level on the vertical axis, and we had the level of real GDP on the horizontal. And do you guys remember, what did the LRAS look like? Was it a vertical line or was it a horizontal line? It was a vertical line. Very good, right? So the LRAS was a vertical line on our aggregate model that looked a little something like this. Okay? Now, remember how I told you to think of this, right? The LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply, is kind of symbolic of a wall. Think of this vertical line as being a wall that represents the best our economy can do in terms of production in the long run, right? And remember, guys, the level of GDP where our long-run aggregate supply curve exists, that's a very special level of GDP, right? It has a couple of important names. I like to think of it as being the maximum capacity, but that's not what they use on the AP exam. Does anybody remember what we called this level of GDP? Okay. There were two names. It was the full employment GDP, also the potential GDP. So guys, you may want to jot that down, please. It's the full employment GDP. It is also referred to as the potential GDP. In other words, guys, that line represents the goal of our economy. That line represents where we want to be operating as an economy. Okay? So, remember guys, the efficiency point that we talked about on the PPC, that represented when we were utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible. And guys, that point is going to correspond to this level of GDP on our aggregate model, right? This point represents when we're utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible. This point represents full employment, just like this level of output represents when we're utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible, right? This level of output represents full employment. So you're going to see, guys, there is a very close link between the production possibilities curve and the long-run aggregate supply. And that's what we're going to try to establish throughout the rest of this part of our lecture. So, to establish this link, guys, let's go through and start answering these questions. Number one says, what information does a PPC provide us about a nation's economy? Right? Guys, it tells us the maximum capacity. Right? When we talked about the PPC, guys, when we talked about this line that bowed out from the origin, we talked about how that basically represented the best our economy could do, right? We could produce anywhere inside of that line and it would be inefficient. But once we got to that line, if we operated at a point on the line itself, we were operating as efficiently as possible. We had reached our maximum capacity. And guys, remind me, were these points outside of this line, were they even attainable? No, right? They were unattainable points. We didn't have the capacity to be able to produce that much stuff. So when you think of that PPC, again, think of that as visually representing the maximum capacity of our economy. Number two, what assumptions do you make about the use of available resources when we draw the PPC, guys, right? We assumed that they were used as efficiently as possible. They were used as efficiently as possible. Remember, guys, there is a reason why points on the line themselves were called efficiency points, because they represent when our resources are being used as efficiently as possible. Okay? Number three, what would cause a nation's PPC to shift? Well, guys, do you remember back in the day, when we talked about shifting our PPC, we talked about economic growth, right? We talked about something that would make our economy more productive and thus increase the maximum capacity that our economy could produce, right? So, what's going to cause a nation's PPC to shift? Anything that would increase economic growth. Okay? And remember, guys, there were a bunch of examples that we talked about that would make us more productive and that would expand our maximum capacity, right? Remember, guys, there could be an increase in the capital stock. In other words, guys, there could be more machines in our economy. There could be more factories in our economy. And if that were the case, that would make us more productive, that would expand our maximum capacity, and that would shift our PPC outward. A few other things, right? If there was an increase in human capital, right? If our workers were better skilled, if our workers were better educated, that would make them more productive, that would make our economy more productive, and that would enhance our maximum capacity, right? That would create economic growth and shift the PPC outward. We could have an advancement in technology. We could have an increase in the quantity or quality of the raw materials that we have. Pretty much, guys, any increase in productivity that's going to increase our maximum capacity, that's going to lead to economic growth, and that is what shifted the production possibilities curve. Okay? Good. Number 4, what do you know about a nation's economy that is operating on the LRAS? Well, that means, guys, that they are operating at maximum capacity. Right? If I'm operating on the LRAS, it doesn't get any better than that in the long run. That represents me utilizing my resources as efficiently as possible. That means I'm at my maximum capacity, right? And again, I hope you're starting to see the link now between what we saw in the PPC and what we see with the LRAS. Number 5, under what conditions would an economy be on the LRAS, right? The economic condition, guys, we called it full employment. Again, we are utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible in the long run, and we are operating at full employment. We are reaching our potential as an economy. Again, I hope you're starting to see the link, again, between the PPC and the LRAS. Number 6, if the price level were to rise, would the LRAS shift? Well, guys, remind me, the price level, is that an inside influence or an outside influence, guys? It's an inside influence, right? It's on the graph itself. And when an inside influence changes, does that shift our line, or do we move along it? Move along it. Very good, right? So the answer here is no. That would not shift the LRAS. That's an inside influence. Furthermore, would the LRAS shift if aggregate demand changes? Well, let's take a look, right? If this is the initial aggregate demand curve, right, and this is where we're operating, if there's an increase in aggregate demand, and if it shifts to the right, this would be the new point. Guys, did that shift in aggregate demand? Did that shift the LRAS, or did we just move to another point on it? We moved to another point. So again, the answer here is no. These things are not what causes the LRAS to shift. All right, and we'll see in just a few moments what does cause the LRAS to shift. Number 7. It says, if an economy finds that it faces the level of production labeled Y sub 1 on the graph above, what's happening in the economy? Okay. Well, let's look back to the graph from the previous page. Let's find out. So guys, here's the graph, right? Here's my vertical long-run aggregate supply. Here's the goal of my economy, and here is Y sub 1. So guys, at Y sub 1, what would you say is happening here? Are we falling short? Are we meeting, or are we exceeding our goal of full employment? We're falling short, right? Y sub 1 is clearly falling short of our goal of full employment. Now, do you guys remember? What do we call this gap in GDP if we're falling short of our goal? A recessionary gap, right? You guys remember this? This is called a recessionary gap. Okay? So that is the condition that our economy is experiencing. So let's go back to the question and let's answer it. Right? Again, at Y sub 1, when we were falling short of our goal of full employment, we were experiencing recession. Because GDP was less than full employment. The next part of the question to ask, guys, if this were the case, what point would the economy lie with respect to the PPC? Guys, if we were experiencing a recession, where would we be on our production possibilities curve? Would we be inside the curve? Would we be on the curve? Or would we be outside the curve? Inside, right? Remember how we called inside points inefficiency points? Those are the points that would occur during times of recession when we're underutilizing our resources. Okay? So this would be, guys, at a point inside the PPC. Very good. Number 8. If the economy finds that it's operating at Y star, this is a typo here, guys, this should say Y star. What condition is the economy experiencing? Well, again, let's look back to our graph and let's see what's happening at Y star, right? So here's the graph, and here's Y star, right at our long-run aggregate supply. And guys, do you remember what's the special name that we call that level of GDP? What condition is the economy experiencing? Full employment, right? We call that full employment GDP. It's also called the potential GDP, okay? So let's write that down on our question. So again, number 8, if we're at Y star, the condition the economy is facing is full employment because we are right at the LRAS, the long-run aggregate supply. We're right at the line that represents the maximum capacity of our economy. Furthermore, it says, if this point were translated to the production possibilities curve, where would it be? Guys, if we were at full employment, would we be at a point inside, on, or outside the PPC? On, right? Those were efficiency points when we were at full employment and utilizing our resources as efficiently as possible, right? So we would be on the PPC, if that were the case. So again, with these questions, guys, I hope you're starting to see the link between the LRAS and what we can interpret from that graph, and the PPC and what we can interpret from that graph. Okay? And finally, guys, for this part, number 9, if an economy finds that it's facing Y sub 2 level of production, what's happening in the economy? Okay? Well, again, let's take a look at the graph. On our graph, guys, the front part of this sheet of paper, the front part of this activity, here is where Y2 is located. So guys, in this scenario, are we falling short, are we meeting, or are we exceeding our goal of full employment? Now we're exceeding it, right? And guys, do you remember, what is this gap in GDP called if we're exceeding full employment? That's an inflationary gap. Very good. Because please don't forget, guys, during times of rapid economic expansion, economists fear inflation. So this is called an inflationary gap. Okay? Good. So the condition the economy is experiencing is inflation. So let's go back down and let's answer that. So again, for number 9, when we're at Y sub 2, the economy is experiencing inflation because GDP exceeds full employment. Now again, it asks, what if that level of production were translated to the PPC graph? Where would that point lie on the PPC, right? And this isn't a perfect translation, but I think you can get the idea. Where would this point be, guys? Inside, on, or outside of the line? It would be on the outside, right? It would be one of those unattainable points, okay? So this would be on a point outside the PPC, okay? Now, one thing I do want to be clear about, because sometimes students get confused, right? You may have looked at that graph and wondered, how could we be operating beyond maximum capacity, right? How is that possible? Well, guys, in the short run, it is possible, because you can overwork your workers, you can overwork your machinery, you basically can overheat your economy and get the surge of production. So in the short run, you can operate beyond maximum capacity. But what did we talk about yesterday, guys? Is that sustainable in the long run? No, right? Eventually my workers are going to break down, eventually the machinery is going to break down, and eventually we'll get back to a more sustainable level of production. Okay? So number 10, building upon what I just said, if the economy were producing at Y sub 2, what would happen in the long run? Right? Well, the short run aggregate supply would decrease because workers and machinery would start breaking down due to being overloaded with work. Right? That Y sub 2, right, when we're exceeding our goal of full employment. It is possible in the short run, but in the long run, the supply curve is going to shift back to where we were initially, Because workers are going to lose productivity, machines are going to lose productivity as they start breaking down because they get overloaded with work. Okay? So, number 11, what would cause a nation's LRAS to shift? Right? Well, hope you're starting to see the link here, right? Since this LRAS represents the maximum capacity, the only thing that could cause it to shift is going to be something that increases the maximum capacity. In other words, guys, economic growth. In other words, guys, anything that would cause the PPC to shift outward would also cause the LRAS to shift outward or shift to the right. Okay? So, guys, let's recap again some of these outside influences that would make our economy more productive and thus increase our maximum capacity and create economic growth. Okay? Guys, we talked about an increase in capital stock if there were more machinery and more factories. We talked about how if there was an increase in human capital, right, if our workers were better skilled or better trained or better educated. We talked about how if there is an advancement in technology, that would make us more productive. We talked about how if there was an increase in the quality or quantity of raw materials, right? And again, there's a lot of other things that could create economic growth, and it all comes down to the basic concept. Any increase in productivity that's going to expand our maximum capacity, that's going to create economic growth, and that is going to shift the LRAS to the right. So that's kind of the big picture idea we're trying to see here, guys. If we have something that causes economic growth, we would label the initial long-run aggregate supply curve with a subscript 1. We would draw an arrow to the right, and then we would draw in our new LRAS and label it with the subscript 2. And this is very important because now, guys, we are starting to see that there are 3 ways to illustrate economic growth, right? The first 2 we learned earlier in our class, right? The first way was to shift the production possibilities curve outward, and we showed that earlier today. The second way to illustrate economic growth is if there was an increase in the real GDP per capita. In other words, guys, if there was an increase in the standard of living, where each person had more stuff they could consume. And now, we've just been taught the third way to illustrate economic growth. The third way to illustrate economic growth is by shifting the LRAS to the right. That would take the wall that represents maximum capacity and it would increase it. It would expand our maximum capacity. It would create economic growth, and we would illustrate that again by shifting the LRAS to the right. Okay? And now, guys, to bring the link between the LRAS and the PPC together, how would a rightward shift in the LRAS be shown on the PPC? Guys, which way would we shift the PPC if we had economic growth? Right? It would be an outward shift, right? It would be a rightward shift, right? It would shift the PPC outward. Right? So an outward shift in the PPC is caused by economic growth, just like a rightward shift in the LRAS is caused by economic growth. That's the link between these 2 graphs. That's the similarity between these 2 graphs. So, any questions, guys, about that link between the LRAS and PPC? No? Okay, good. Next, please open up to the last set of notes that I hope you guys had a chance to print out for today's class. They say the macroeconomic model, short run to long run at the top. Guys, please number these page 8. This will be the 8th page in the Unit 4 section of your notes. Now, this is what they title it, but guys, page 8, this PDF that I hope you guys had a chance to print out. For us, guys, please title it self-correction, because that's what we're going to try to illustrate through looking at this set of notes. Okay? And guys, we're not going to write a whole lot down here. I just want to use the graphs that they provided for us to help illustrate how self-correction works.
Teachers, for your viewing and pleasure, for those who couldn't make it to the show, you so desire. I believe it's on channel 11. It should have sound as well. Multicultural show.
All right, so the purpose of this activity, guys, is to show you how self-correction works and how we can illustrate it via the aggregate model. Now, before we get any further, guys, do you remember who believes in self-correction? Classicals or Keynesians? Classicals, right? Remember, classicals were the firm believers in self-correction. Now, do you remember why they believed in this, guys? Did they believe in flexible prices or sticky prices? flexible, right? That is why classicals thought the economy would self-correct, that prices and wages would adjust automatically to help fix recession or to help fix inflation, okay? So, again, guys, I want to emphasize here, we're talking about self-correction. Please make sure you're writing this down. We're talking about classical economics, and we're talking about the flexible prices and wages that classical economists believe in, okay? So, let's see how it would work. Well, on our graph that we see here initially, guys, that point that I just identified would be the original long-run equilibrium, okay? And guys, if we could stay at that point forever, it'd be great. But unfortunately, we can't, right? Things change, and these perfect situations don't last forever. So guys, let's say some outside influence caused an increase in total spending. Let's say interest rates dropped, and as a result, businesses started spending more, and as a result, total spending in our economy rose. We shifted aggregate demand to the right. Now, as a result of that shift, this represents our new short-run equilibrium. That point represents what's happening now in our economy. And hopefully you guys can see we are operating beyond our goal of full employment, right? So do you guys remember what kind of gap do we see here if we're exceeding our goal of full employment? That's an inflationary gap that we see right here in GDP. Okay? So now what's happening in our economy, guys, is there's been an increase in inflation. That is an imbalance. That's bad for the economy, and we're going to see how self-correction would fix it. Now, let me ask you this, guys. If you were a worker and you noticed that the price level was going up and up and up, and that your wages were losing purchasing power, what do you think would happen to the wage that you demanded from your worker? Would you want higher wages or lower wages during times of inflation? If your dollars were losing purchasing power, would you demand higher wages or lower wages? Higher wages, right? During times of inflation, classical economists argue that workers will demand higher wages to keep pace with inflation. Okay? And that increase in wages, guys, is very important. That's what triggers the self-correction that classicals believe in. Now, do you remember, guys, these wages represent a cost of production. So, guys, when wages go up, is it easier or harder for businesses to produce now? Now it's harder because they got to pay their workers more. So that triggers a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve, and that's where the self-correction comes in. When the aggregate supply curve corrects and shifts based on what happens in the economy. Okay? So here's what would happen. We would label this original supply curve with a subscript 1, right? And wages will increase, and the supply will decrease until we get back to a long-run equilibrium. So this is where we need to draw our next aggregate supply curve that has been shifted right, that has been shifted left. And that's how self-correction would occur. During times of inflation, when the economy is growing very rapidly, workers start to demand higher wages. Those higher wages make it more difficult for businesses to produce, so total production decreases, it shifts left until we get back to a long-run equilibrium. Okay? So that's how self-correction fixes inflation. Now, let's take a look at the last part of this set of notes, and let's take a look at how self-correction fixes recession. Okay? And I'll post this online. I'll do it right now in the video, and I'll post it online. Have a good day. And guys, please be good for the sub next week. Please be good for the sub next week. Thank you. Okay? Now, to see how this would fix a recession, all right? Here is the initial long-run equilibrium. That point represents what's happening now in the economy. If that long-run equilibrium could last forever, that would be great. But unfortunately, it's not going to happen, right? Things happen, things change. And what happens in this problem is a negative supply shock, right? Let's say there's an increase in the cost of production. That makes it harder to produce, and as a result, we have a negative supply shock. The supply curve shifts to the left. So now, this represents our new short-run equilibrium. That point represents what's happening now in our economy. So, at this new point, notice what happens, guys. We are now falling short of our goal of full employment. So, we have what's called a recessionary gap. So, in this scenario, we are now experiencing a recession. We're now experiencing a slowdown in economic activity. And I want to show you how self-correction will fix this. Okay? Now, during times of the recession, when the economy is slowing down, workers are not going to get as high wages. businesses are not going to be able to pay their workers as much, and as a result, there'll be a decrease in wages, right? And that decrease in wages is the key here. That is what's going to trigger the self-correction, right? That decrease in wages lowers the costs that businesses have to pay to produce, and as a result, it becomes easier to produce. And this decrease in wages will trigger an increase in the short-run aggregate supply. That is how self-correction kicks in. So now, I know it kind of sounds funny, right? But the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift right back to where it was originally, and we get right back to our long-run equilibrium. And that is how self-correction would fix a recession. Okay? So guys, please don't forget, we have 4 online quizzes you need to get done by the time I get back to my honeymoon, right? You've got aggregate equilibrium, you've got long-run aggregate supply, LRAS, you've got economic growth 3, and you've got self-correction. So please, get those 4 online quizzes done by the time I get back from my honeymoon. And please, be good for the sub next week. Okay? Thank you.